إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excelencias, distinguidos participantes.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, I hereby declare the 30th meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. We will now begin our interactive dialogue on the oral presentation of the High Commissioner of the findings of the periodic report of OHCHR on the situation of human rights in Ukraine as mandated in Human Rights Council Resolution 59/22, and on the interim report of the Secretary General on the situation of human rights in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, as mandated in General Assembly Resolution 80/223. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I have the honor to welcome and give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights. Sir, you have the floor.
Señor Vicepresidente, muchas gracias. Distinguished delegates, today is a day of mourning in Kyiv. Russia's horrifying attack in the early hours of Thursday killed at least 30 civilians and injured at least 99 more. It is one of the deadliest attacks on Kyiv city since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and yet another tragic reminder of why this senseless war must end. Instead of moving closer towards peace, civilians are enduring more destruction, pain, and suffering. Between 1 December 2025 and 31 May 2026, my office verified that at least 1,270 civilians were killed and 6,850 injured in Ukraine. This represents a 40% increase compared to the same period last year. The real toll is likely higher. In Ukraine, 96% of casualties occurred in territory controlled by the government. This spike is largely due to the Russian Federation's use of long-range weapons and drones. For example, on 13 and 14 May this year, Russian armed forces launched more than 1,500 drones and missiles across 8 regions of Ukraine and Kyiv city, killing 27 civilians and injuring at least 83. There have also been civilian casualties in territory occupied by the Russian Federation. On 22 May, 21 civilians were killed and others injured when an educational complex was struck in occupied Starobilsk in Luhansk region during attack in the city by Ukrainian armed forces. Russian authorities have reported that between 1 December 2025 and 31 May 2026, 205 civilians were killed and 1,302 injured in 27 regions in the Russian Federation. My office has not been able to verify these casualties, and I repeat my call to the Russian authorities to facilitate access by my office for independent verification. The situation is also dire on both sides of the front line, where short-range drone attacks caused a 57% increase in civilian casualties compared with the same period 12 months earlier. Some 380 civilians were killed and more than 2,000 people were injured. In territory controlled by the government of Ukraine, drones have struck clearly marked humanitarian vehicles and facilities, impeding people trying to flee and the delivery of humanitarian aid. In occupied territory, thousands of civilians are trapped along the front line in Kherson region, facing severe risks to their lives, food shortages, and lack of health care due to drone strikes and landmines. A local ceasefire is urgently needed so people can move to safer areas. Since mid-November 2025, my office has verified that Russian forces have executed at least 20 captured Ukrainian servicemen. During the reporting period, my office interviewed 129 released Ukrainian prisoners of war. Virtually all of them provided detailed accounts of torture or other ill treatment during their captivity, including sexual violence. This is consistent with our previous findings of widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian captivity. Around half the prisoners of war captured by Ukraine interviewed by my office described torture or other ill treatment predominantly in transit facilities before transfer to official detention facilities. The prohibition of torture is absolute. The use of torture against prisoners of war must end immediately, and those responsible must be held to account. Mr. Vice President, last winter was the coldest in Ukraine for 15 years. Between October 2025 and March 2026, Russian armed forces systematically and repeatedly targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, particularly facilities providing heating for urban areas as temperatures dropped. These attacks left hundreds of thousands of civilians across the country without electricity, heating, and hot water, sometimes for weeks, as outside temperatures fell below -20 degrees centigrade. Water supplies were cut, schools were closed, and access to healthcare was disrupted. Older people and people with disabilities were often unable to leave their apartments because elevators were not operational, further isolating them and preventing them from reaching shelters during air raids. The scale and scope of the Russian Federation's attacks suggest they were intended to disable Ukraine's energy network as a whole, rather than strike specific military objectives. Treating Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure as a military objective is incompatible with international humanitarian law. Ukrainian armed forces also attacked electricity and heating infrastructure in the Belgorod region of the Russian Federation on at least 7 occasions so far this year, causing temporary outages according to Russian authorities. My office could not fully verify the damage or the impact of these attacks on civilians. Mr. Vice President, the Russian authorities continued to violate the laws of occupation. This includes compelling people in territory they occupy to swear allegiance to the Russian Federation, forcing people to join the Russian armed forces, carrying out forcible transfers and deportations, and imposing their legal and governance system. Restrictions on freedom of expression continue. Courts issued arrest warrants and fines against more than 160 people for expressing anti-war views or pro-Ukrainian sentiment. The occupying authorities have also accelerated efforts to seize private property. As of December 2025, our office recorded that nearly 40,000 residential properties were at risk of confiscation. This war has inflicted immense human suffering and destabilized the region. One recent study estimates it has caused more than 2 million military casualties. It is steadily poisoning air, groundwater, and soil, including that used for agriculture. We know that it will have a lasting, devastating impact on the environment inherited by future generations. Beyond the battlefield, the war continues to drive up food and energy costs, put pressure on economies, intensify political tensions, and turbocharge spending on weapons. It is making our world less safe, and any risk of further escalation needs to be averted. I urge renewed efforts to negotiate a sustainable peace grounded in human rights and in line with the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Accountability for all these horrific violations is essential. Protecting human rights is key to building the trust and confidence required for any sustainable peace and can provide a vital opening for meaningful dialogue. This war is cutting deep physical and psychological wounds. Human rights need to guide efforts to secure lasting peace. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. According to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegations of the countries concerned by the reports. I see that the representative of the Russian Federation is not in the room. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the update and expresses its sincere appreciation to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission for its indispensable work. And thanks for mentioning the mourning day today in Kyiv. Every reporting period confirms the same painful reality. Russia's war is not only a military assault against Ukraine, it is a deliberate attack on our people, our identity, on our future. Over the past months, Russian missiles and drones have continued to kill civilians on an almost daily basis. Homes, hospitals, schools, energy infrastructure, and humanitarian facilities remain among their targets. Yet behind every statistic, there are people whose lives have been permanently changed. On 15th June, Russia struck the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, one of the Ukrainian's oldest spiritual centers and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A drone hit the Dormition Cathedral, the heart of this 1,000-year-old monastery. This was not merely another attack on a building, it was an attack on the memory of a nation. Russia continues to destroy churches, museums, libraries, and cultural heritage because it seeks not only to occupy territory, but to erase the identity of the people who have lived here for centuries. Dear High Commissioner, your report also reminds us that occupation is not only measured by checkpoints and soldiers. It is measured by fear becoming part of everyday life, when going outside is dangerous, when food, water, and medicine becomes a matter of survival, when your own home no longer feels safe, when women are forced to hide their appearance out of fear of sexual violence. Occupation is when leaving your home may cost your life. Today, thousands of civilians in Oleshki and Hola Pristan remain trapped between Russian positions, mines, and constant drone attacks. Families struggle to obtain food, drinking water, and medicines. Elderly people cannot reach hospitals. Children grow up without safety, without normality, and sometimes without hope. Meanwhile, millions of Ukrainians living under temporary occupation continue to face relentless persecution. Russia suppresses any expression of Ukrainian identity, punishes those who oppose the occupation, forces children into militarized education, pressures families to embrace Russian propaganda, and seeks to reshape an entire generation through fear and indoctrination. This is not governance. It is an attempt to erase a nation. And for those taken into Russian captivity, the nightmare only deepens. Russia has turned torture into an instrument of state policy, and Ukrainian prisoners of war remain the most vulnerable in this system. They endorse starvation, humiliation, physical and psychological abuse designed not only to extract information, but to destroy human dignity itself. Dear colleagues, these crimes are committed because Russia believes that time will normalize them. It believes that repeated attacks against civilians will become ordinary, that torture will be reduced to another statistic, and that occupation will be accepted as reality. We must prove Russia is wrong. Ukraine calls upon the international community to maintain pressure on the aggressor, support the work of international accountability mechanisms, and insists on full, safe, and unhindered access for international monitors to all temporary occupied territories of Ukraine. Because justice delayed is not only justice denied. For those still living under occupation, for those still imprisoned, and for those who will never return home, justice is hope. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite interested delegations to ask questions on the presentation that we have just heard. The list of speakers is now closed. I'd like to give the floor first to distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, and thank you, and dear High Commissioner. I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. And we remain appalled by the wide range of violations by Russian authorities of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, as reported by OCHR monitoring mission. The independently gathered and verified evidence confronts us once again with Russia's disregard for civilian life. Indeed, during the reporting period, attacks caused more civilian deaths and injuries than in the same period of any year since the full-scale invasion, except for 2022. Furthermore, in the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by Russia, including Crimea, Russian authorities continue to severely restrict fundamental freedoms and access to education and commit serious human rights violations. Further, they continue depriving civilians of any genuine choice to remain or return to the occupied territories. We reiterate our unwavering commitment to supporting efforts aimed at bringing all perpetrators to justice and preventing further crimes in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including the ICC investigations. In 2025, the legal foundation of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine and the International Claims Commission was laid. In this context, the enlarged partial agreement on the Management Committee for the Special Tribunal was adopted on 15th of May 2026. We encourage all states to continue engaging with these accountability mechanisms, and we will continue to work collectively to uphold accountability.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. Vice President, the EU thanks the High Commissioner. Last year was the deadliest for civilians in Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression, with the highest number of casualties recorded in May this year. The EU condemns deliberate targeting by Russia of Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure and the executions of prisoners of war by the Russian armed forces. We recall that the Commission of Inquiry showed the gravity of violations increased, including war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia. Mr. Vice President, the report by the Secretary General highlights continuing violations of IHRL and IHL by Russia in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including extrajudicial executions, torture, sexual violence against civilian detainees, inhumane detention conditions, and forced disappearance, transfer of protected persons, including children, and other violations of rights of inhabitants. The EU condemns these violations and abuses perpetrated by Russian armed forces and occupying authorities, and is committed to ensuring accountability for all international crimes. The EU demands that Russia ceases its aggression, withdraws from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We urge Russia to ensure the return of all forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. High Commissioner, how can the Council further contribute to the protection of children in the temporarily occupied territories of
Muchas
Ukraine?
gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. We thank the High Commissioner for the oral update and the Secretary General for his report. The findings presented are deeply concerning and point to a continued patterns of blatant disregard for international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We are extremely alarmed by the ever-rising number of civilian casualties, with conflict-related hostilities causing more civilian deaths and injuries than in the same period of any year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Further systematic attacks on energy facilities across Ukraine have destroyed critical infrastructure, such as energy facilities and heating systems, affecting all aspects of civilian life across the country. We condemn in the strongest terms Russia's efforts to impose patriotic military education on Ukrainian children, coerce them into swearing allegiance to the Russian Federation, and the erasure of the Ukrainian language. Continued reports of torture and ill treatment of civilians and prisoners of war underscore the urgent need for independent investigations and accountability. We, the Nordic Baltic states, reaffirm our unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We remain committed to supporting all efforts aimed at ensuring accountability for violations of international law and securing justice and reparation for victims and survivors. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of UNICEF.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. UNICEF welcomes this oral update and interactive dialogue. In the last few days alone, at least 2 children have been reportedly killed and many more injured in attacks, a tragic reminder of the war's devastating impact on children and families. Child casualties rose by 66% in May compared to the same months last year, and more than 3,600 children have now been killed or injured since the start of the full-scale war, according to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Most child casualties resulted from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Attacks have also severely impinged on access to essential services for children, their families, and communities. For instance, attacks on water facilities in the Donetsk region have exposed more than 100,000 people to water rationing and the potential of acute water shortages, which increase public health dangers, adds pressure to already strained healthcare facilities, and heightens protection risks, including displacement. UNICEF calls on parties to the conflict to adhere to their obligation under international law and for an end to grave violations against children. What every child needs now is an immediate end to the war. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
Mr. Vice President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his oral update and note with appreciation the interim report of the Secretary General. Bulgaria reiterates its strong condemnation of the Russian Federation's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. We condemn Russia's continued strikes against civilians and civilian infrastructures in Ukraine, including energy assets. We are outraged by the continuing violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We are deeply concerned by the systematic violations of the ethno-cultural rights of the Bulgarian national minority in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Russian authorities have restricted and subsequently banned the teaching of the Bulgarian language. We are outraged that the activities of the Bulgarian Sunday schools and cultural centers have been suspended while Russian curricula are being imposed in local schools. We are deeply worried about the human rights situation of children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including their forced deportation and subsequent placement in social centers and with Russian families. Bulgaria reiterates its unwavering support for Ukraine, its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within the international recognized borders. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Czech Republic.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. The Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. Documentation of human rights violations continues to play a crucial role within this technical mandate. We strongly condemn violation of international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation, as described in the Secretary General's report, including forcible transfers and deportations, forced conscriptions, and extrajudicial execution of civilians. The Czech Republic further expresses concern over legislative changes in the temporarily occupied territories, including amendments affecting the right to education and aimed to restricting teaching in the Ukrainian language and promoting Russian narratives glorifying the war. We call on Russia to immediately release all unjustly imprisoned representatives of civil society, along with all prisoners of war and arbitrarily detained civilians, including children. We highlight the cases of Crimean political prisoners, namely Irina Danilovich, Tofik Abdulaziev, Lenur Kalilov, and Esma Nimetulayeva, whose courage deserves our recognition and continued support. Mr. High Commissioner, how can the Council contribute to countering the indoctrination of children by the Russian state in the temporarily occupied territories, while ensuring their right to education in the Ukrainian language is fully respected? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and the statement by the group of Friends of Accountability. Thank you, High Commissioner, for your update, which comes after Ukraine has just had to suffer through the worst night of attacks since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression, with at least 30 civilians dead and 100 injured. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law. Civilians are bearing the brunt of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. In the occupied territories, Russia systematically instills fear, repressing those who refuse accepting Russian occupation and enforcement of Russian nationality. We are alarmed by the reports by the Secretary General and the Human Rights Monitoring Mission on Ukraine, documenting extrajudicial executions, torture, including sexual violence, arbitrary detention, forced disappearances, and coerced expropriation and nationalization of property by Russia. Germany is particularly concerned about the situation children face in the occupied territories: indoctrination, militarization, and forced transfers from their homes, families, and identity. We urge Russia to facilitate their safe and immediate return. We are also appalled by the Russian occupying forces' targeted restrictions of particular groups, including the religious freedom of Crimean Tatars. Mr. High Commissioner, how can we better address accountability gaps? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Romania.
Thank you, Vice President. Romania aligns itself with the statements delivered by the EU and the Group of Friends of Accountability. We thank the High Commissioner for his presentation and commend the continued work of OHCHR in monitoring the human rights situation in Ukraine. Latest reports highlight that attacks against civilian infrastructure, particularly energy facilities, continue to have devastating human rights consequences for the people of Ukraine. The disruption of electricity, heating, and water disproportionately affects the most vulnerable, including children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and women. Romania is equally concerned by the continued violations documented in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, including arbitrary detention, torture, forced conscription, but also the systematic imposition of the Russian educational system and the reported militarization of education. These practices undermine the right to education, the preservation of cultural identity, and the rights of the child, in violation of fundamental human rights as well as international humanitarian law. We call on the Russian Federation to end these violations, to comply fully with its international law obligations, and to ensure accountability for those responsible. Romania reiterates once again its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. High Commissioner, based on the findings of your report, where could further technical cooperation by OHCHR provide the greatest added value in addressing the human rights impact of attacks on civilian infrastructure? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Vice President, we share the High Commissioner's deep concern over the escalation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, with OHCHR verifying that the first 5 months of 2026 saw more civilians killed or injured than the same period in any of the previous 3 years. The Commission of Inquiry and other UN human rights mechanisms likewise document increasingly grave violations, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, underscoring the necessity for accountability. We strongly condemn the intensified attacks on civilians and civilians' infrastructure, including relentless drone strikes causing mass casualties and terror among the population. Mr. President, the CG's report confirms a pattern of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea and Sevastopol. It details coercive policies and practice suppressing Ukrainian identity and fundamental freedoms, accompanied by torture, conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detention, extrajudicial executions, forced conscription, and the transfer and deportation of protected persons, especially children. We call for full and unhindered access by the OHCHR and other human rights monitoring bodies and investigative mechanisms to advance accountability for violations of international law committed in Russia's war of aggression. Montenegro reaffirms its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and international law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Mr. Vice President, Greece aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. We fully concur with the findings of the latest report of the Secretary General, which, like the 13 previous reports presented since 2018, once again highlights widespread violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Greece is particularly concerned by the forcible transfer and deportation of protected persons, including children. We call for an immediate end to these practices and for the provision of full information regarding Ukrainian children who have been forcibly transferred or deported. We also underscore the importance of full cooperation with the Central Tracing Agency of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The documented cases of torture, ill treatment, conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and unlawful confiscation of property represent grave violations of international law. Accountability remains essential. The international community should continue to document these crimes and resist any attempts to normalize or legitimize violations of international law. We also regret Russia's continued lack of cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner, reflecting a disregard for its obligations under international law. Greece reiterates its unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner for the presentation. Let me start by strongly condemning the most recent Russia's massive attack on Kyiv and other cities, leaving dozens of dead and wounded. Mr. President, Vice President, millions of civilians in Ukraine were affected by repeated large-scale attacks on Ukraine's electricity and heating infrastructure during the winter 25-26. These attacks have clearly violated international humanitarian law and put at risk countries' nuclear stability. Electricity and heating were disrupted in homes, schools, kindergartens, hospitals. The damage affected all aspects of civilian life. Indoor temperatures dropped very low, water supply was disrupted, healthcare and education services were interrupted. The steady increase in the number of civilian casualties caused by Russia's illegal attack is extremely disturbing. As I reported, execution of 37 Ukrainian servicemen. We reaffirm our strong condemnation of the widespread and systemic use of torture and ill treatment against Ukrainian prisoners of war. In the temporarily occupied territories, fundamental freedoms continue to be severely restricted, while Russian Federation continue imposing its own political, legal, and administrative systems in violation of IHL. All these illegal and brutal acts must stop. We reiterate our call on Russia to immediately cease its aggression against Ukraine and withdraw military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Mr. Vice President, Slovakia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We thank High Commissioner for the report and commend the work of his office in documenting human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, despite the continued lack of access. We remain deeply concerned by ongoing measures aimed at compelling residents to acquire Russian citizenship, as well as by forced conscription, deportations, and restrictions on return. Reports of torture, ill treatment, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances are alarming. We are equally concerned by the continued restrictions on fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and religion, as well as by measures affecting the preservation of cultural heritage. The rights of children deserve special attention, including the right to education and the preservation of their identity. Slovakia calls on the Russian Federation to comply fully with the obligations under international law and to grant to international monitoring mechanisms safe, immediate, and unhindered access to all temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Mr. High Commissioner, how can member states further support the work of your office in protecting human rights in these territories? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The UK thanks the High Commissioner and the Secretary-General for their report. Our thoughts are with those affected by Russia's devastating attack on Kyiv this week. We remain deeply concerned by Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine and ongoing human rights atrocities in temporarily occupied territories, including Crimea. We condemn Russia's actions highlighted in the reports, including restrictions on fundamental freedoms, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture and ill treatment, and the persecution of Crimean Tatars and other communities. We are also concerned by the transfer and deportation of Ukrainian civilians and children. The UK reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. We remain committed to supporting accountability for violations of international law and continue to support international efforts to maintain attention on Crimea, including through the International Crimea Platform. We welcome continued UN monitoring and reporting, which remain vital for promoting accountability and protecting human rights. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. Thank you very much, Vice President. France is very concerned at the alarming increase of Russian attacks against the civilian populations and the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, which have been documented by the report of OHCHR and the UN Secretary General. We see these as systematic attacks that aim to deprive the Ukrainian population of heating, for example, during winter, and of electricity, as well as other essential services. Mass attacks conducted yesterday against Kiev, again against civilian areas, have made many victims and are part of the same logics. These are serious international humanitarian law violations. In all illegally occupied territories, the report of the Secretary General says that there is generalized pressure and violence on the civilian population, including cases of torture and arbitrary detention and forced transfer of children. We reiterate our firm support for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We are committed and stand alongside Ukrainians, international partners and institutions and international courts to combat impunity of the perpetrators of such crimes. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. Vice President, Italy aligns with the EU statement
and remains deeply concerned about grave violations of international human rights and humanitarian law committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine and Crimea. The report has documented the inter alia forcible transfers and deportation of civilians, including children, violations of the rights to life, torture or ill treatment in detention, restrictions on fundamental freedoms and breaches of economic, social and cultural rights, sexual and gender-based violence. These alarming findings underscore the need to ensure accountability for international crimes, including through unhindered access for international monitoring mechanism, in order to deliver justice to victims and to prevent the recurrence of such atrocities. Italy reaffirms solidarity and unwavering support for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Sustainable peace must be grounded in respect for international law, as well as independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Mr. High Commissioner, which measures could be promoted to ensure the safe return of civilians, including children, who have been forcibly transferred from the occupied territories of Ukraine? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. First of all, I express sincere condolences to the families of innocent victims of yesterday's Russian large-scale ballistic missile and drone attacks. Mr. Vice Chair, regrettably, Secretary General's report once again contains compelling evidence of the Russian Federation's continued violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, not to mention systematic efforts to suppress Ukrainian identity. Georgia remains deeply alarmed that these grave violations continue with impunity and that the Russian Federation, despite repeated calls by the UN, has once again refused to grant the OHCHR and other international monitoring mechanisms safe and unhindered access to the temporarily occupied territories. We are particularly concerned with the facts of discrimination against Ukrainian citizens who refuse to acquire Russian citizenship, continued persecution of Crimean Tatars, and forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children. Georgia once again underlines the necessity of bringing justice to all victims through international legal mechanisms. We emphasize the urgent need for the Russian Federation to provide immediate, safe, and unhindered access to OHCHR and other international humanitarian and human rights mechanisms to all of the Crimea and other temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has taken note of the oral presentation of the High Commissioner and the interim report of the Secretary General. The presentation and the reports, while purportedly addressing the human rights situation in Ukraine, focusing overwhelmingly on criticism of the Russian Federation, which further illustrates the one-sided and politicized nature. We regret the continuous selectivity and politically motivated approach reflected in the presentation and the reports. Such double standards undermine the principles of objectivity, impartiality, and non-selectivity. We affirm our opposition to the politicization of human rights issues and to any attempt to use human rights mechanisms as a tool for interference in the internal affairs of states. The DPRK expresses its solidarity with the Russian Federation and support all efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful and lasting settlement. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le
Vice President. Our thanks to the High Commissioner and the Secretary General for their reports. Switzerland is deeply concerned by documented violations of international humanitarian law. Repeated attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure have deprived millions of civilians of electricity during extreme cold period, and they continue with increasing brutality. And this week, we've once again seen a massive attack against residential areas, which killed very many civilians. In the temporarily occupied territories, we deplore the documented extrajudiciary killings, cases of torture, sexual violence, transfers and deportations, as well as forced conscription. the pressure exerted on people to impose Russian nationality and restrictions to teaching in the Ukrainian language and attacks against private life are not simply administrative measures. They affect the exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and their cumulative effect is an attack against the identity, the language, and the cultural life of those who live under occupation. We condemn these violations committed by the authorities and the Russian armed forces. Switzerland calls on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. High Commissioner, what measures, in your view, would allow for better protection of the civilian population, notably in the temporarily occupied territories? Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Korea thanks the High Commissioner for his oral presentation. We are deeply concerned that the war in Ukraine has escalated sharply in recent months, with grave consequences for civilians and civilian infrastructure. The worsening situation underscores the need for sustained international attention and engagement. We remain alarmed by continued reports of torture, ill treatment, and enforced disappearance, as well as forcible transfers and deportations of protected persons. We are particularly concerned by reports that such violations have largely not been investigated or prosecuted, while unhindered access for OHCHR and other human rights monitoring mechanisms has yet to be ensured. These developments underscore the urgent need to bring an end to the suffering of civilians and to ensure full compliance with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We hope that negotiations will resume soon and lead to meaningful progress. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the international community in support of Ukraine's peace, recovery, and reconstruction. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Belarus. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. The Secretary General's regular report on the situation in Crimea does not contain any information related to item 10 of the HRC agenda. This discrepancy, as well as the one-sided, selective, and accusatory rhetoric against the Russian Federation that is repeated from one report to another, underlines the political goal of the sponsors of the resolution, the authors of the report. Hiding behind the biased position of the UN in this conflict, the Ukrainian authorities are expanding targeted and deliberate attacks against the population, civilian vehicles, and infrastructure on the territory of Russia, the victims of which are Belarusian citizens. This is unacceptable. The population of the Crimean Peninsula is particularly affected by such attacks, including the death and injury of children, the interruption of water supply, and electricity. Belarus calls for an objective and impartial assessment of the actions that lead to the suffering of civilians. We're extremely concerned with the provocative statements and unsubstantiated allegations of the Ukrainian side, which carry the risk of exacerbating and escalating the conflict. Being the epicenter of regional confrontation, Belarus is more interested than anyone else in de-escalating military political tensions and resolving the conflict. Call on other countries as well as international organizations to direct their efforts to achieve peace. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Liechtenstein thanks the High Commissioner for his oral update, as well as the Secretary General for his report on the human rights situation in Crimea. We remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation across Ukraine, including rising civilian casualties, the torture and ill treatment of prisoners of war, and persistent restrictions on fundamental rights in territories temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, including Crimea. In these territories, Ukrainian citizens continue to face forcible transfer, threats, and intimidation for holding pro-Ukrainian views, forcing many to leave their homes. Those expressing views critical of the Russian authorities or the war, including in digital spaces, reportedly face sanctions such as imprisonment and forced labor. We are also gravely concerned by reports that civilian detainees have been subjected to widespread and systematic acts that may amount to torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence. Families continue to face serious obstacles in obtaining information about the whereabouts and fate of their loved ones. Mr. Vice President, the OHCHR and other monitoring mechanisms continued to be denied access to temporarily occupied territories. Liechtenstein urges the Russian Federation to grant such access without delay. Independent documentation remains essential to ensuring accountability and holding perpetrators responsible. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor
Vice President. The Council Agenda Item 10 was established to provide genuine cooperation and capacity building, always with the consent of the state concerned and via constructive dialogue. Selectivity, double standards, and politicization do not contribute to human rights protection. Quite the reverse, they undermine the credibility of this Council and they do not benefit those that most need assistance. Resolution 59/22 is a clear example of how item 10 is being stripped of meaning. Instead of focusing on technical cooperation, the focus is on applying unilateral condemnation, and it leads to biased narratives, ignoring the deep-seated reasons for the conflict and the responsibilities of all parties. Venezuela is faithful to the principles of the UN Charter, and we're in favor of inclusive dialogue and seeking solutions which are peaceful and which guarantee peace and the respect of the human rights of all without interference or external imposition. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Albania.
Vice President. Albania thanks the High Commissioner for his oral update and the Secretary General for his interim report. Taken together, the two reports demonstrate that the human rights consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine continue to deepen. The civilians continue to bear the heaviest burden of the war through attacks on populated areas and civilian infrastructure, unlawful killing, torture, conflict-related sexual violence, and other serious violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. These violations are compounded in the temporarily occupied territory, including Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We remain particularly concerned by the continued deportation and forcible transfer of children, civilians, including children. Albania unequivocally reaffirmed its unwavering support for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border, including Crimea. We call on the Russian Federation to fully comply with its obligation under international law, implement the recommendation contained in the report, and grant immediate, safe, and unhindered access to the occupied territories for international monitoring mechanism. Respect the UN Charter and international law remains the only basis for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria aligns with the EU statement. We remain gravely concerned about the increasing number of civilian casualties, the vast majority of which are the result of military operation by Russian armed forces on Ukrainian territory. In addition, the continued systemic and targeted attacks of energy facilities across Ukraine by Russian armed forces further severely impacts the daily lives of the civilian population in Ukraine. Serious violations against prisoners of war remain a major concern. We are deeply concerned about accounts of continued torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence and dire detention conditions in facilities managed by the Russian Federation. The willful killing of prisoners of war is strictly prohibited under international law and classified as a war crime. We urge the full respect for international humanitarian and human rights law and reiterate the call for full accountability for all violations and unhindered access for humanitarian access and independent monitors. High Commissioner, the occupying authorities of the Russian Federation have repeatedly ignored their duties and obligations under international law. Can you speak further on the impact on the civilian population, particularly in Crimea, after more than 12 years of occupation? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his comprehensive update. Slovenia strongly condemns the continued violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation in temporarily occupied territories, as highlighted in the Secretary General's report. Attacks on the freedom of opinion and expression, the systematic intimidation and harassment of human rights defenders, lawyers, local activists, journalists, and community leaders need to stop. Once again, Slovenia strongly condemns the forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children by Russian authorities. We call upon the Russian Federation to ensure their immediate, safe, and unconditional return, and facilitate family reunification, and to refrain from making any changes to their personal status, including nationality. The forced adoption and re-education of Ukrainian children constitute grave breaches of international law and a violation of the fundamental rights of the child, aiming to erase Ukrainian identity and undermine the preservation of its future generations. High Commissioner, how can this Council better support efforts to ensure full accountability for these persistent violations? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, we too thank the High Commissioner. The war in Ukraine is a serious threat to the security and stability of our region. We mourn the loss of lives and in the irreparable damage being done to humans and to international law, and note the day of mourning. Turkey supports Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, including Crimea. Turkey has regarded the resolution of the conflict through diplomacy and dialogue as a primary objective. In 22 and 25, we ensured direct contact between the parties and made progress, particularly on humanitarian issues. The current blockage of diplomatic channels increases the risk of further escalation of the war and future loss of lives. Turkey will continue to play a facilitating role in diplomatic initiatives to end the war. A just and lasting peace is also an outcome that Crimean Tatar Turks have been yearning for many years. Crimean Tatar Turks have the right to live in their ancestral lands freely, securely, and peacefully. Instead, they are subject to consistent intimidation, mistreatment, and persecution. We will continue our efforts to ensure the safety and well-being of Crimean Tatar Turks and to protect their rights and interests in close dialogue with our friends and partners. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. High Commissioner, Russia's use of the powerful weapon in densely populated urban area made May the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians in 4 years. According to the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, the Russian Federation has committed crimes against humanity against Ukrainian children, including deportation and forcible transfer, as well as enforced disappearance. Russian arms and security forces has been added to the so-called list of shame in the UN Secretary General report on the conflict-related sexual violence. Finally, in June, Russia damaged the Kiev Pecher's Lavra, one of the most important sites of the Orthodox Christianity and the UNESCO World Heritage Site. These are the actions of the country that seeks to portray itself as a defender of traditional values and Christian faith. We call on the international community to reject this false narrative and to see Russia's barbaric acts for that they are. We will continue to work with our partners to ensure that those responsible for the serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law are held accountable for their crimes. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. Vice President, the Sovereign of Malta thanks the High Commissioner for his report. His conclusions raise a fundamental aspect of this ongoing conflict, the necessity for all parties engaged to fully respect human rights laws and international humanitarian law. In the perspective of a post-conflict period, it is an indispensable condition for rebuilding confidence and trust among the parties, especially after the immense suffering the concerned populations have incurred. As an independent and neutral humanitarian actor, we urge once more all parties to respect IHL principles. To this end, all efforts undertaken by the United Nations by specialized organs must be strongly supported. Present in Ukraine since more than 35 years, the Order of Malta has developed since 2022 its largest emergency response program since World War II, with over 4 million people receiving shelter, food assistance, medicines, and prosthetic services, with psychological and rehabilitation support for thousands of minors and veterans. This effort will be pursued as long as necessary. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, Vice President. Australia thanks the High Commissioner for the update and the Office of the High Commissioner and Secretary-General for its report, which once again underscores the devastating human rights impact of Russia's unprovoked and unjustifiable full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We remain deeply concerned by consistent reports of widespread violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law within the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, which include attacks against civilians and critical infrastructure, arbitrary detention, torture and ill treatment, including prisoners of war, and the forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children, one of the most reprehensible aspects of Russia's invasion. Russia's acts have caused wide-scale and compounding human suffering that risk entrenching long-term trauma across Ukraine. Accountability is essential to deter future abuses and provide justice to the victims of Russia's brutal attacks. Australia reaffirms its steadfast support for Ukraine and calls on Russia to end its war of aggression and to fully comply with its international obligations. High Commissioner, while Russia continues to block OHCHR's access to Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories, how can we best support OHCHR's mandate? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Council of Europe.
Vice President, we thank the Secretary General for his report and the High Commissioner for his oral update. We share the serious concerns about the escalation of hostilities and the continuing violations of international human rights law by the Russian Federation as it pursues its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The recent deadly attack on Kiev serves as a fresh reminder of the horrendous suffering and destruction inflicted on civilians for a fifth consecutive year. In the temporarily occupied territories, the new laws and policies enacted by Russia in breach of its obligations as an occupying power bear witness to a systematic strategy with the aim of asserting dominance on the Ukrainian population and erasure of their identity. Such measures are imposed in a climate of violence and well-established patterns of grave human rights violations. Secretary General's report refers to the European Court of Human Rights judgment in the interstate case Ukraine and the Netherlands versus Russia. Russia's obligation to implement this judgment is clear under international law. It is regrettable that the Russian government has refused to cooperate on the establishment of an international and independent mechanism to secure the identification of transferred children, restoration of contacts, and safe reunification. The Council of Europe remains committed to supporting comprehensive accountability. 36 countries and the EU signed the enlarged partial agreement on the Management Committee of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine. The process of ratification of the Convention establishing a Claims Commission as part of an international compensation mechanism is well underway. Justice is indispensable to lasting peace. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Portugal.
Mr. Vice President, Portugal welcomes the High Commissioner's presentation and the Secretary-General's interim report. Occupation is measured not only in territory, but also in the erosion of human dignity and hope. The findings of this report highlight the importance of United Nations and independent monitoring mechanisms, which shed light on systematic violations in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including arbitrary detention, torture, sexual violence, and forced disappearances, restriction on fundamental freedoms, and the persecution of Crimean Tatars and others who refuse to renounce their identity. Children are, regrettably, among those most affected, including in their access to education. International human rights law and international humanitarian law must be fully respected. Violations must be investigated. Victims must have access to justice, and those responsible must be held accountable. We urge the Russian Federation to grant OHCHR and other independent monitors immediate, safe and unhindered access to all temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Portugal condemns Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, including attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. High Commissioner, where do you see the most significant remaining?
Thank you very much, says the chair. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. Vice President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. We are deeply alarmed by the findings of the OHCHR's monitoring mission. During the reporting period, the Russian Federation's large-scale use of long-range weapons resulted in more civilian deaths and injuries than in any previous year except 2022. According to the report, the Russian authorities continue to impose severe restrictions on freedom of expression, forcibly conscript protected persons into the Russian armed forces, and deny children access to education in the Ukrainian language. The Secretary General's report raises serious concerns about the continued alleged violations of IHRL and IHL by the Russian Federation. Any forcible transfer or deportation of protected persons, including children and civilians deprived of liberty, must cease immediately. As a country that continues to endure the consequences of foreign invasion and occupation, we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Cyprus reiterates the importance of the work carried out by the OHCHR and underscores the need for full, safe, and unhindered access to all temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to enable comprehensive monitoring, which is essential to ensuring accountability. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of North Macedonia.
Vice President, we remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation resulting from the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine and the ongoing occupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. We are also alarmed by the increase in civilian casualties. Since February 2022, the UN has verified more than 62,000 civilian casualties, a devastating human cost and the apparent disregard for obligation under IHL. The reports highlight the devastating impact of attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure during the winter 25-26, which left millions of civilians without reliable access to electricity, heating, and water. Women, children, and older persons have all been disproportionately affected. We are further gravely concerned by reports documenting the execution of prisoners of war, allegation of torture and ill treatment in detention, and the continued use of conflict-related sexual violence. In the occupied territories, restriction of freedom of expression persists, while arbitrary detention, unfair trials, and measures aimed at eroding Ukrainian identity remain deeply concerned. We call for full, safe, and unhindered access for OHCHR and other international monitoring mechanisms to all occupied territories and urge the Russian Federation to fully comply with its obligation under international law. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Mr. Vice President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements of the EU and the Group of Friends of Accountability. In the light of Russia's recent attacks on Kiev, as highlighted by the Commissioner's introductory remarks, we wish to express our solidarity with Ukraine and condemn this aggression. And we are deeply alarmed by the continued documentation of numerous violations of international law by the Russian authorities, as also outlined in the latest reports. They show a pattern of systemic torture and ill treatment of civilians and a sharp increase in civilian casualties during the reporting period, the highest since 2022. Moreover, in illegally occupied Ukrainian territories, fundamental freedoms and access to education are severely curtailed. This pattern is compounded by one of the most alarming aspects of Russia's aggression, the illegal deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia and to temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. And in the absence of Russia's willingness to withdraw from the territories it occupies, we demand that Russia stops its attempt to erase Ukrainian culture in those territories and ensure the immediate and safe return of all Ukrainian children, in line with its obligations under international law. And we cannot allow the perpetrators of these grave violations to go unpunished. In this regard, the Netherlands calls upon all states to support Ukraine of aggression and the International Claims Commission. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. Vice President, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for his update and the Secretary General for the interim report. More than 4 years after the start of Russia's full-scale aggression, the human rights situation in Ukraine remains alarming. We are deeply concerned by the continued and widespread violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including attacks against civilian and civilian infrastructure, arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearances, and the deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children. We are particularly alarmed that, according to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, May 2026 was the deadliest month for civilians since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. These figures once again demonstrate the devastating consequences of Russia's continued attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Croatia reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. We reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its aggression, withdraw all its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully comply with its obligations under international law. We also express our full support for the work of UNHRC and all international accountability mechanisms documenting violations and preserving evidence for future justice. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Secretary General for his report and the High Commissioner for the update. We remain gravely concerned by the continuing deterioration of the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. We are particularly alarmed by reports of persistent restrictions on fundamental freedoms and the intimidation and prosecution of those expressing dissenting views, including members of the Crimean Tatar community. We are equally concerned by reports of the forcible transfer and deportation of civilians, including children, and reiterate our call for the safe return of all unlawfully transferred and deported Ukrainian children. We echo the Secretary General's call for full respect for international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and reiterate the importance of full and unimpeded access for international and regional human rights monitoring mechanisms to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. Malta reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and calls for accountability for all human rights violations and abuses, and violations of international humanitarian law. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Spain. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Spain aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union and is grateful for the oral update and presentation of an interim report. We note with deep concern the report's findings, which document the continued impact of hostilities on civilians, including casualties and injuries, forced displacement, and significant damage to critical civilian infrastructure. Today, we witnessed recent attacks that led to the suffering of numerous civilians and serious humanitarian consequences. Spain stressed the importance of ensuring full respect of IHL and international human rights law. Protection of civilians should be a priority. We are concerned, just like other organizations, the situation of Ukrainian minors in temporarily occupied territories or those who have been illegally deported to Russian Federation. We ask that their indoctrination cease and that they be returned to the families immediately. Spain reiterates the importance of accountability for serious violations that have been documented, including detentions. We call for an end to impunity. and ensure independent investigations. We reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, and call upon Russia to put an end of this unjust war. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We align ourselves with the EU statement. Belgium is deeply alarmed by the sharp rise in civilian casualties, which have reached their highest level in 4 years as the Russian Federation intensifies attacks along the front line and on cities across the country. Russia must immediately end its war of aggression and unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine. We remain appalled by the systematic and widespread use of torture against civilians and prisoners of war as reported, and call on all parties to ensure full compliance with international law. The SG's report provides a disturbing account of how the Russian Federation continues to entrench its occupation by systematically replacing Ukrainian institutions with its own. An increasingly repressive environment is being imposed through expanded digital surveillance and a range of coercive measures, including property confiscation, forced conscription, and imposed citizenship policies aimed at reshaping society under occupation. We continue to urge the Russian authorities to facilitate without delay the return of transferred or deported Ukrainian children and their reunification with their families or legal guardians. High Commissioner, in light of the access restrictions and rising civilian casualties, what more can be done to strengthen the protection of civilians? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to thank the High Commissioner for his overall update on the dire human rights situation in Ukraine. We also appreciate the Secretary General's interim report on the human rights situation in Crimea. More than 4 years have passed since Russia launched its aggression against Ukraine. We wish to underline once again that this aggression constitutes a clear violation of international law and shakes the very foundation of the international order. If such violations were tolerated, it would set a dangerous precedent. We once again condemn in the strongest terms Russia's indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian cities, which have led to widespread civilian casualties and extensive damage to civilian objects, including invaluable cultural heritage sites. We express our respect for the Ukrainian people who have demonstrated immense bravery in standing up against Russia's aggression day after day. Japan will continue to stand firmly with Ukraine and the international community until a just and lasting peace is achieved in Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. We'd like to thank the High Commissioner and the Secretary General for their reports, as well as the Commission on Inquiry for very important work. Luxembourg remains seriously concerned by the cases registered of forced transfer of children and demand the immediate unconditional return. We deplore the absence of any replies of the Russian Federation to the requests by the High Commissioner to ensure access to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to ensure human rights. The report once again stresses that acts of torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence have been committed against detainees. Investigations should be carried out in order for victims to receive adequate compensations, taking into account gender-related issues. We reaffirm the importance to guarantee to all persons living in Ukrainian territories that are temporarily occupied the liberty of freedom of expression, education, and assembly. We express our full support to Ukraine and condemn all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Thank you. Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could include in this part of our dialogue. We'll now turn to the list of speakers of national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to Ukrainian Parliament Commission for Human Rights, a video statement.
Chair, High Commissioner, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen,
For more than 12 years, Ukraine has been living under ongoing Russian aggression. Since February 2022, the full-scale invasion launched by the Russian Federation has brought millions of Ukrainians a daily reality of fear, loss, and systematic human rights violations. Every day, civilians across Ukraine suffer from missile strikes, artillery shelling, and drone attacks. Residential buildings, hospitals, schools, and critical infrastructure are being destroyed. Millions endured this winter without electricity, heating, or water due to deliberate Russian attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. But it is children who suffer the most from this war. Ukrainian children wake up to air raid sirens, spend hours in shelters, lose their homes, their health, and tragically, their lives. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, at least 705 children have been killed and more than 2,530 have been injured. These are not just numbers. These are stolen childhoods. Particularly, attention must be paid to temporarily occupied Crimea.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to War Resisters International.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, WRI, together with its partner Connection EV, expresses its solidarity with the people of Ukraine suffered from the military aggression of the Russian Federation. We are concerned of the ongoing forced mobilization in the Russian-occupied territory, as highlighted once more in the report of General Secretary. There are reports of 600 conscripted people and coercion to sign contracts in violation of international humanitarian law. We are also concerned of the ongoing violation of the human right to conscientious objection to military service, that's freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, by the Ukrainian authorities. The 2025 EPCO report reveals that at least 110 religious objectors have been jailed last year and 1,000 forcibly held in the army. The Jehovah's Witness Volodymyr Klementiev and Seventh-day Adventist Andris Clear are among those receiving longest sentences. A recent journalist investigation has reported that the Baptist Dmitry Koval was tortured to death for fasting and asking for no military service in Scaly Assault Regiment. There are 26 known similar cases. As reported at the last session, Yuri Shevchenko, a Quaker human rights defender and conscientious objector, suffered illegal arrest in Kiev in March and cruel treatment while arbitrarily detained by the military. We urge Russia to implement international humanitarian law and cease its war of aggression. We call on Ukraine to cease persecution and criminalization of Yuri Shevchenko and other conscientious objectors to military service and ensure their immediate acquittal. We urge member states to fully support diplomatic avenues to immediately stop this war. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Center for Global Non-Killing.
Mr. President, Excellencies, everyone. The Secretary General's report documents torture, conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detention, the forcible transfer of children, and the systematic suppression of Ukrainian identity in the temporarily occupied territories. These violations create long-term trauma that threatens future peace and security. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda reminds us that sustainable peace requires more than accountability. Healing from trauma is essential to breaking cycles of violence, rebuilding trust, and enabling meaningful participation in peacebuilding. The report documents widespread conflict-related sexual violence. Survivors must have access to survivor-centered justice, psychosocial support, and gender-responsive reparations. Justice should not only prosecute perpetrators, it must also restore the dignity and agency of survivors. The Center for Global Non-Killing calls on all member states to strengthen the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda by integrating trauma-informed mental health and psychosocial support into humanitarian assistance, accountability mechanisms, and recovery efforts, while ensuring the meaningful participation of women, including survivors, in peacebuilding and reconstruction. Sustainable peace is achieved when justice, healing, and restoration prevent trauma from becoming the next generation's inheritance. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. This is a joint statement supported by a consortium of Ukrainian and Swiss institutions working together on a Caring to Survive, Surviving to Care project. We heard today about widespread and systematic attacks on heating and electrical infrastructure in Ukraine, as well as a steadily rising number of civilian casualties due to the Russian aggression. Ukrainian population's ability to receive and provide care is the unspoken victim of these violations. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has fragmented families, weakened community networks, increased long-term displacement, and placed unprecedented pressure on social infrastructure. Children face prolonged educational disruption and psychological distress, while older persons increasingly depend on informal family care. In this context, millions of women have become primary providers of material, emotional, and intergenerational care while navigating power shortages, displacement, and the erosion of public services. These transformations require renewed attention to care as a matter of public responsibility rather than private adaptation. Mr. Vice President, state social infrastructure is a primary source of care and services necessary for citizens to enjoy human rights. But in the conditions of war, it becomes overburdened and underfunded. Our research has shown that neighborhood and family networks step in to fill this gap. Yet displacement and prolonged insecurity is weakening these social ties, leaving many isolated and without support systems. Ukraine urgently needs
Muchas
peace.
gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Legal Action Worldwide.
President. Mr. Ruslan Lavrik, a Ukrainian engineer, used to work at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In June 2024, Mr. Lavrik was snatched from his home, detained, and cut off from the outside world by Russian troops. He was beaten, tortured, and starved. As of today, he has been arbitrarily detained for more than 2 years. In February of this year, Legal Action Worldwide submitted a complaint to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on behalf of 10 Ukrainian civilians arbitrarily detained by Russia, including Mr. Lavrik. The complainants remain in captivity, along with thousands of others. These crimes are well documented by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, yet little has been done for the detainees. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of Ukrainian civilians unlawfully detained by Russia, followed by an independent investigation and the payment of compensation by Russia. Moreover, Russia will likely ignore any findings that challenge its actions and continue its unlawful patterns of detention. It has done so in the past. Such impunity cannot be allowed. Mr. Vice President, what will member states and the Human Rights Council do to ensure that UN mechanisms are respected and that Ukrainian civilians arbitrarily detained by Russia are released?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations.
Mr. President, our organization welcomes the High Commissioner's report and urges the Council to maintain scrutiny of crimes committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. We wish to draw urgent attention to Kherson region, where civilians continue to live under a campaign known as the Kherson Safari. Recent reports from June 26 show that Russian drone attacks against civilians continue, including attacks on people at bus stops, in residential areas, on streets, and in civilian vehicles. Civilians have been watched, pursued, and attacked by drones while carrying out ordinary activities. Ambulances, first reporters, humanitarian workers, and medical facilities have also been targeted. These attacks restrict movement and block access to food and medical care. The UN Commission of Inquiry has concluded that Russian drone attacks against civilians in Kherson region amounted to crimes against humanity and war crimes. Across all occupied territories, Russia continues arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture, forced passportization, forced conscription, the suppression of Ukrainian language, culture, and civic life. Policies targeting Ukrainian children, including forced transfer, militarization, and indoctrination, raise grave concerns under the Genocide Convention. Documentation must now be matched with accountability for crimes committed by the Russian Federation. We urge the Council to support independent investigations, cooperation with the International Criminal Court, and other accountability mechanisms, and meaningful reparations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Human Rights Research League.
Thank you, Mr. President. Human Rights Research League remains deeply concerned by the Russian Federation's continuing disregard for the most fundamental rules governing human rights and humanitarian law, as also depicted by the High Commissioner's oral update and documented by the report of the Secretary General. We are particularly appalled by the pressure exerted on residents in the temporarily occupied territories to suppress their Ukrainian identity, swear allegiance to the occupying power, obtain Russian citizenship, and even enlist in the Russian armed forces. Furthermore, we condemn the continuing deportations and forceful transfers of civilians including children separated from their parents or legal guardians from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to the Russian Federation, and urge all member states to exert pressure to uphold General Assembly Resolution ES 11/9, asking Russia to cease without delay any further practice of forcible transfer and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. As thoroughly documented by the Secretary General's report, Ukrainian civilians continue to be subjected to extrajudicial executions, torture, and enforced disappearances. As this year marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, we also urge this Council and Member States to increase their efforts to work towards the full implementation of this Convention. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Human Rights House Foundation.
Thank you, Vice President. The Secretary General's report on Crimea reminds us that occupation is sustained through fear, coercion, and the deliberate removal of people from the protection of the law. The latest joint reporting coming from Crimean Process, Human Rights House Crimea, and the Educational Human Rights House Chernihiv identify enforced disappearances as a systematic and coordinated practice. They describe a pattern of abduction, incommunicado detention, torture, concealment of information, and then the attempted legalization of detention through fabricated criminal cases. This practice targets not only activist journalists and Crimean Tatars, but also ordinary civilians, people with pro-Ukrainian views, relatives of service members, workers in critical infrastructure, and those refusing to cooperate with the occupying authorities. Families are also victims. They are left without information, legal certainty, or meaningful access to remedies. We remain deeply concerned for all civilians unlawfully detained by Russia, including Crimean artist and activist Bohdan Ziza, sentenced to 15 years after his public protest against Russia's aggression. Vice President, we ask the High Commissioner's Office, pending access to occupied territories, what further practical steps can be taken to strengthen tracing, documentation, and follow-up on enforced disappearance cases. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Mr. Vice President, FIDH and Truth Hounds thank the High Commissioner for his update on the human rights situation in Ukraine. Since 2022, Russia has reportedly recruited over 28,000 foreigners into its armed forces, excluding North Koreans. Exploiting socioeconomic and legal vulnerabilities, Russia is targeting migrants, workers, and students, both inside Russia and in countries of origin, in every region of the world, in a global and predatory recruitment scheme. While some join the Russian army voluntarily, most are lured by promises of civilian jobs, high wages, and Russian citizenship. Many are deceived or coerced through threats and violence. All of them end up on the battlefield and face near certain death or injury. Cases documented by our organizations confirm a state-sponsored practice of human trafficking in breach of Russia's obligations under the UN Palermo Protocol. In 2026, Russia reportedly plans to recruit thousands more foreigners. This furthers Russia's aggression and increases global security and human trafficking risks, as some states are negotiating with Russia to significantly scale up labor migration. FIDH and Truth Hounds urge states to take all necessary measures to end Russia's predatory recruitment, to prevent human trafficking, and to protect their citizens from being killed or injured in Russia's war of aggression, namely to publicly acknowledge Russia's illicit recruitment, issue warnings, and to hold all those involved to account. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Conscience and Peace Tax International.
Mr. Vice President, Conscience and Peace Tax International, CPTI, thanks the Secretary General for his report and the High Commissioner for his oral update. Existential threat may trigger a hyper-reactive societal or governmental mindset that demands absolute cohesion and severely punishes non-conformity. However, international law allows no derogation from the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, even in wartime. We deeply regret that Ukraine has suspended provision for the right of conscientious objection to military service, subjecting objectors to prosecution. Overriding deeply rooted human mechanisms that reject violence introduces profound psychological trauma and degrades democratic resilience. Simultaneously, the Russian Federation weaponizes its apparatus in occupied Ukrainian territories such as Crimea, enforcing illegal conscription via digital notices, while separately penalizing pacifist expressions as extremism, suppressing moral diversity and forcing citizens to kill or financially subsidize warfare erodes domestic and international trust across front lines. CPTI asks, how can the UN ensure that states at war continue to recognize conscientious objection to military service and address illegal conscription, thus demonstrating that honoring these obligations preserves individuals' right to freedom of conscience and strengthens collective democratic security? At the same time, all states must be reminded of their obligation not to return conscientious objectors to military service to states where they're liable to persecution. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Human Rights Now.
Now continues to express deep concern over the ongoing human rights and humanitarian crisis caused by the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion. The protection of civilians is deteriorating rapidly. People are forced to live in fear of long-range missile and drone attacks, with tracking drone strikes in particular severely obstructing civilian evacuation and rescue. In occupied territories, grave human rights violations and war crimes persist, including the systematic and untraceable abduction of children, sexual violence, arbitrary detention, torture, forced imposition of Russian citizenship, and the ban on the Ukrainian language. In March 2026, the UN Commission inquiry verified over 1,200 cases of forcible child transfers and found that approximately 80% of these children have still not been returned. Furthermore, reports indicate that Russia is deploying foreign nationals and vulnerable migrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America to the front lines. They are often recruited through deception, coercion, and false promises of employment or citizenship, raising grave concerns over their exploitation. We call on the international community to unite in strengthening initiatives for accountability for these violations and war crimes, and to intensify political and economic pressure to end Russia's invasion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate during this dialogue, and I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Volker Türk for his concluding remarks.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you, Vice President.
Also thank the delegations for all their statements and the non-governmental organizations as well. We are in the 5th year of this unmitigated war, unmitigated tragedy, which is this war. And I have to say, of course, the direct impact that it has on the people in Ukraine and the way that this war has been waged and the escalation that we have seen should give everyone cause for concern. Because beyond, as I mentioned also during my statement, beyond the borders, this is about the effect that war has and the corrosive effect that it has on societies at large, but also on the respect for international law. And that respect is really going to the core of the Charter of the United Nations and the core of the international humanitarian and human rights law framework. And if one goes through the various questions that you have raised, and if you cluster them, you will see what I mean by that. There are obligations of an occupying power. And these obligations require the occupying power to respect the existing laws and institutions of the occupied territory. And the occupying power should not introduce far-reaching changes to the existing order, because that's what the law of occupation, the law on occupied territory requires. It's to preserve the rights of people who live under occupation, which is understood under international law to be temporary. What we have seen is the exact opposite. It's an imposition of an order that violates almost each and every facet of that law. And this has direct impact on the Ukrainians who live in the Russian-controlled areas, because they, for instance, have to comply with extremely discriminatory laws and major restrictions, and with an imposition of an order that is not theirs. So the clear message is respect the law of occupation, and respect Ukrainian laws and institutions, because that's what exactly is required. There were a lot of questions about the treatment of children in occupied territory. And again, the obligations are clear. The Russian Federation must refrain from any further actions which restrict the rights of children. It needs to amend its policy on countering extremism so that Ukrainian nationalism is not considered extremism. They need to protect freedom of expression. It needs to provide children with culturally appropriate education, which is free from propaganda for war and represents Ukraine as an independent country. It needs to restore online access and for education following the Ukrainian state curriculum, as well as Ukrainian communication networks and media. So there is a lot that the law says, and that needs to be done. And the only message is very clear. It goes back to the Russian Federation to respect this. I have reported separately on the human rights situation in Crimea, and I just want to refer you to our reporting on that. On the return of children, because you have asked what the international community could do, they need to continue, you need to continue urging the Russian Federation to submit information to the Central Tracing Agency about each child, to refrain from changing the personal status of these children, including their names and nationality, and to ensure that no adoptions of Ukrainian children who are separated from their parents or guardians take place. I think there's also a need to support Ukraine with financial and technical assistance to ensure that every child, a Ukrainian child returned, can be reunited with family or placed in proper care arrangements and can access services, including notably psychosocial support. Accountability. I mean, it's clear. And we and my office, myself, we have strongly encouraged strong international support for accountability mechanisms, both international and domestic, to ensure that justice for victims, including in occupied territory, is served, and to lay the foundations for long-term reconciliation. And it is clear that accurate, impartial, well-documented facts are a critical first step in accountability efforts that are victim-centered and that ensure that violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law are properly documented through the office, through the monitoring mission that we have on the ground. And we obviously need to make sure that this documentation is also made available to whatever accountability mechanisms exist, as I mentioned, either at the national or at the international level. It also means continued engagement and support for the International Criminal Court in its own investigations. And I just want to perhaps at the end say how important it is when there are, if there are and when there are peace negotiations, that there needs to be a strong focus on the rights of people, both in the occupied territory, but obviously also for the people who have been suffering for much too long. And we need sustained advocacy for the various human rights issues that we have identified over all these years, that they feed into that process of peace negotiations, because otherwise it will not be sustainable. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And this brings our interactive dialogue to a close. My thanks to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for his participation today. We will now have a short technical break before we begin the interactive dialogue on the Office of the High Commissioner's report on technical assistance and capacity building for South Sudan.
Excellencias,
Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we can now begin the interactive dialogue on the comprehensive report from the High Commissioner's Office on technical assistance and capacity building for South Sudan, as mandated by Council Resolution 58/31. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I have the honor to welcome and give the floor to Ms. Maarit Kohonen Sharif, Director of Global Operations Division. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to present the report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights on technical assistance and capacity building for South Sudan, covering the period from January to December 2025, and as contained in Report A/HRC/62/57. During the reporting period, UNMISS Human Rights Division, whose director is sitting right next to me here, Mr. Gassama, conducted 137 capacity building activities, reaching over 7,200 participants, including more than 3,200 women, strengthening the capacity of security forces, justice actors, and civil society to promote and protect human rights. These efforts were implemented in a highly challenging environment, characterized by a deteriorating security situation, persistent violations against civilians, weakened rule of law institutions, all of which continue to constrain protection outcomes. In addition, financial constraints faced by the United Nations, coupled with reductions in human rights staffing within UNMISS, have affected the delivery and scale of activities, limiting outreach and impact at a time of heightened need. Yet, sustained human rights technical assistance and capacity building must be maintained and scaled up, as they have contributed to some gradual, though still fragile, progress in advancing accountability and institutional capacity. And this is only possible also due to the close partnership between the authorities, including the Ministry of Justice of South Sudan and other national stakeholders, UNMISS, UN agencies, and the African Union. For example, support to justice institutions, including capacity building for judges and prosecutors, and the provision of legal advisory services in partnership with national legal aid clinics, contributed to 253 criminal convictions, including 34 involving members of security forces, resulting in deterrence and the prevention of violations. At the same time, structural weaknesses in the justice system, combined with shortages of courts, investigators, and legal aid, continue to impede access to justice and contribute to persistent impunity, particularly involving actions by security actors. Targeted engagement with legal aid providers also enabled the release of 69 individuals held in prolonged or arbitrary detention, representing approximately 65% of the cases identified and contributing to efforts to reduce overcrowding. At the community level, support to mobile courts, including logistical, technical, and advisory assistance, alongside strengthened victims assistance mechanisms, help to reduce barriers to justice and strengthen confidence in formal systems, including for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Trainings and workshops organized for security actors have also led to some behavioral changes, including the vacating of schools previously occupied by armed forces. Progress was also made in the advancing the transitional justice agenda. Key legislation establishing the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Compensation Reparation Authority has been adopted, and steps have been taken towards their operationalization through inclusive South Sudanese-led processes. Also, national and state human rights institutions have strengthened their monitoring, reporting, and outreach capacities, while civil society has become more coordinated and effective in contributing to a national dialogue on accountability and reconciliation. Mr. Vice President, in 2025, the UNMISS Human Rights Division documented 1,158 conflict-related incidents affecting 5,108 victims, representing a 40% increase compared to the previous year. Civilians still continue to be deliberately and indiscriminately targeted, reflecting a worsening protection crisis and a continued failure by parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international law. Conflict-related sexual violence remains widespread and severe. The report documents 144 incidents affecting 247 survivors, including women and girls, decreased from the previous year, the nature of violations has become increasingly grave, with rape, gang rape, and abduction-related sexual violence having increased significantly. And these figures likely underrepresent the true scale of violations due to stigma, underreporting, insecurity, and lack of access to services. Civic space also remains constrained, affecting journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society actors who continue to face intimidation, harassment, and arbitrary detention. Recent developments, including the announcement of elections scheduled for 22 December 2026, mark an important milestone in South Sudan's political transition. However, the current context of insecurity, institutional fragility, and limited capacity underscore the urgent need for enhanced technical assistance and capacity building to support credible, inclusive, and peaceful elections and an electoral process. Strengthened support will be essential to bolster the preparedness of institutions, promote civic trust, and mitigate risks of violence during the electoral period. The recent renewal of the UNMISS mandate by the Security Council reaffirms the centrality of human rights to the maintenance of peace and stability, and provides a critical framework for sustained monitoring, reporting, and engagement with national authorities and other stakeholders, particularly in a context of heightened political and security tensions. The renewed mandate, although more limited in scope, further underscores the importance of continued technical assistance and capacity building to strengthen national institutions, advance accountability efforts, and enhance the protection of civilians. Mr. Vice President, the report before you today calls on the government of South Sudan to take concrete measures to address entrenched impunity, including by ensuring independent, impartial, and credible investigations into all violations and holding perpetrators accountable, including those in positions of authority. It urges decisive steps to safeguard civic space, guarantee fundamental freedoms, and strengthen the rule of law through enhanced judicial and prosecutorial capacity. Crucially, it calls for the expeditious establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan in close cooperation with the African Union as an essential mechanism for accountability for serious crimes and for restoring public confidence in justice processes. We have reiterated this call several times already. The report also calls on the United Nations and member states to sustain and expand technical assistance and capacity building, particularly in justice sector reform, prevention of conflict-related sexual violence, protection of civic space, and support to national human rights institutions and civil society, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. The message of the report is clear. While the human rights situation in South Sudan remains deeply concerning, sustained engagement, national ownership, state accountability, and coordinated and continued international support can deliver tangible results. The challenge before us is to consolidate these gains, address persistent gaps, and ensure that the rights of all people in South Sudan are respected, protected, and fulfilled. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. According to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned by the report. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Sudan, Your Excellency, Mr. Wek Mamer Kol, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I have the honor to address this council on behalf of the government and people of the Republic of South Sudan. I extend my gratitude to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the presentation of its report on technical assistance and capacity building for South Sudan. We appreciate the continued technical support provided by the Office and Human Rights Division within the United Nations in South Sudan, UNMISS, as well as other United Nations agencies and stakeholders, including UNDP, to strengthen our national institutions, promote the rule of law, and advance the promotion of protection of human rights. We reaffirm our commitment and political will to advance promotion and protection of human rights as enshrined in our technical document, the Transitional Constitution 2011 as amended, and in the agreement of 2018, and in the core United Nations Convention, of which South Sudan has become party to, despite the considerable challenges and our young nation continues to face. South Sudan reiterates its steadfast position to be addressed under item 10 rather than item 4. We firmly believe that technical assistance, capacity building, and genuine partnership remain the most effective means for supporting countries facing complex post-conflict challenges such as our country, to strengthen national institutions and fulfill their human rights obligations while respecting national ownership and sovereignty. We acknowledge the concerns highlighted in the report regarding the recent security situation in the country, which are also concerns of our government, and we remain committed to working with regional and international partners to restore stability and fully implement the agreement. Despite significant challenges, my government has continued to make tangible progress, including leading a national legal reform agenda to strengthening the justice and the rule of law system, and advancing the implementation of transitional justice mechanism of Chapter 5 of the agreement, strengthening measures to prevent and respond to gender-based and conflict-related sexual violence, address accountability, improving access to justice, and supporting for supervisors, and preparing for peaceful, inclusive, and credible election in December 2026. While recognizing the observations contained in the report, we wish to emphasize that South Sudan's challenges should be understood within the context of a young nation emerging from years of conflict while simultaneously building state institutions almost from the ground up. Many of the recommendations continued in the report required substantial financial resources, technical expertise, and sustained institutional support that exceeds our current national capacities. Based on this, we therefore request the Office and our development partners to continue providing predictable, long-term technical and financial assistance that responds to the following nationally identified priorities: establishment of the transitional justice institutions and reform to enhance implementation of the agreement. 2, training of rule of law stakeholders such as judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement agencies on criminal justice, effective handling of cases of gender-based violence, legislative reform, and on international humanitarian law and international human rights standards. Provision of legal aid services to vulnerable people to ensure equal protection under law and access to justice. Provision of support to government institutions in implementation of the observations and recommendation of the Universal Periodic Review, UPR. Provision of support to the Human Rights Council to enhance and to enable to prepare national report to the human rights bodies and mechanisms. In conclusion, South Sudan remains grateful for continued support of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and its partners, and it looks forward to working together in a spirit of constructive cooperation and coordination with the government within the framework of mutual respect to achieve lasting peace, stability, sustainable development, and to enhance its efforts in meeting its international human rights obligation. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias,
I thank you, Excellency. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions or make comments on the presentation that we have just heard. The list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. Vice President, we thank for the update. The EU remains deeply concerned by the human rights situation in South Sudan and the persistent failure to implement the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict. Systematic violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including rampant sexual and gender-based violence, continue and must be met with accountability. We urge all parties to return to dialogue and recommit to the revitalized peace agreement, including the establishment of the hybrid court. Only through sustained political will, regional cooperation, transitional justice, and inclusive governance can South Sudan achieve lasting peace. We call on the transitional government and all stakeholders to protect civilians, uphold human rights, and restore stability. With an election date announced, we are deeply concerned by the systematic exclusion of key political stakeholders and continued deviations from and unilateral modifications of the peace agreement. The EU will continue to support the development of South Sudan, in particular education, health, agriculture, infrastructure, and governance sectors, and providing humanitarian assistance, which alone amounted to over 100 million euros last year. I thank you.
muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Kenya on behalf of the Group of African States.
President, the African Group commends the South Sudan for its continued cooperation with the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, as well as other human rights mechanisms, including the UNHRC. Further applaud South Sudan for achieving milestone progress in implementation of the revitalized agreement, including by announcing recently that the general election will be conducted in 22nd December 2026. In addition to the concrete legal steps taken to enact two main transitional justice and accountability mechanisms, notably the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and Compensation and Reparatory Authority. The group underscores that provision of technical assistance and capacity building to South Sudan as a post-conflict country represent the best way to assist the rule of law institutions and enhance promotion and protection of human rights in the country, as well as the implementation of the revitalized agreement. The group reiterates its steadfast position that item 10 should be prioritized as one of the essential items on the Human Rights Council's agenda, despite current liquidity crisis and financial constraints, with the aim to help improve promotion and protection of human rights in countries in need, such as South Sudan, tailored to their sovereign priorities after prior consultation and the content of the concerned state. We firmly maintain that the appropriate agenda item under which South Sudan should be addressed in the Human Rights Council is agenda item 10 rather than agenda item 2, as the violations of human rights alleged to have been occurring in the country could mainly be attributed to lack of training and capacity building for the law enforcement agencies and the rule of law institution. The full statement will be available in the extranet. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thailand attaches great importance to technical cooperation and capacity building as one of the most practical and effective tools for advancing human rights on the ground. We commend the government of South Sudan for its continued engagement with the international community, including OHCHR and regional partners. We also welcome the progress made in implementing the revitalized peace agreement. We echo the view expressed in OHCHR's report on the need to provide technical assistance and capacity building to South Sudan to ensure peaceful and successful general election scheduled to be held in December this year. Thailand believes that effective technical cooperation must be guided by national ownership and respond to the needs and priorities of the country concerned. Sustainable capacity building is essential to strengthening national institutions and enabling countries to address human rights challenges independently. Thailand remains committed to supporting South Sudan and wishes the country every success in its journey towards lasting peace, stability, and sustainable development. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We align with the statement of the African Group. We take note of the report of the OHCHR. We commend the government of South Sudan for the milestones they continue to register amidst existing challenges, especially establishment of the transitional justice and truth, reconciliation and healing institutions thus far. Provision of technical assistance and capacity building to South Sudan, as and upon request, will enhance the capacity of the respective national institutions and systems and will help rebuild the post-conflict fragile institutions to ensure promotion and protection of human rights. We emphasize that the capacity building provided to South Sudan should be tailored to the real needs on ground, informed by the extensive consultation and consent of the South Sudanese government to address the capacity gaps. We therefore call upon the international community to enjoin and support to fund capacity building rendered by OHCHR to the government of South Sudan for sustainable peace, security, and development of the country. My government remains committed to work with the government of South Sudan to ensure sustainable peace. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner for this report and commend OHCHR's continued technical assistance in South Sudan. The report makes clear that the human rights situation continues to deteriorate. Escalating political tensions and intensified hostilities have driven a sharp increase in violence, with civilians continuing to bear the brunt, including through indiscriminate attacks and widespread sexual violence. All parties must meet their obligations under the revitalised agreement and international law and take steps to de-escalate, protect civilians and prevent further deterioration. While we note some progress, including legislation on transitional justice, implementation remains far too slow. Continued delays to the hybrid court risk entrenching impunity and undermining confidence in the peace process. We are deeply concerned by restrictions on civic space, including harassment and intimidation of civil society and journalists. Technical assistance plays an important role, but cannot replace political will. We urge the transitional government to advance accountability, operationalise transitional justice mechanisms, and protect civic space. South Sudan's leaders now face a clear choice: translate commitments into action or risk further instability and suffering for civilians. We urge renewed political engagement, including with regional partners, to put the country back on a credible path towards peace, justice, and democratic governance. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Rwanda takes note of the report of the Office of the High Commissioner and welcomes the continued technical assistance and capacity building provided in supporting South Sudan. Rwanda aligns itself with the statement delivered by Kenya on behalf of the African Group. We welcome the continued efforts to strengthen national institutions in South Sudan with support from the OHCHR, UNMISS, the African Union, and other partners, particularly in transitional justice, the justice sector, and national human rights institutions, including training for judicial officers, law enforcement personnel, and civil society. Technical assistance and capacity building remain essential to strengthening national institutions, support national ownership, and ensure sustainable progress in the promotion and protection of human rights. Rwanda encourages continued technical assistance and capacity building, guided by the priorities of the government of the Republic of South Sudan and aligned with the African-led efforts to support peace, stability, reconciliation, and institutional building for the benefit of the people of South Sudan. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
Vice President Selun thanks the High Commissioner for the report and aligns with the statements delivered by Kenya on behalf of the African Group. Selun acknowledges the ongoing efforts of the transitional government to promote peace and security in South Sudan, but remains concerned about reports of human rights violations. We also welcome the announcement of the general elections scheduled for December of this year. We view this election as an important step towards strengthening democratic governance and consolidating peace. We commend the transitional government's establishment of the Compensation and Reparatory Authority. This is an important step towards peace building and supporting victims of past violations. Based on our experience, we believe that these developments can meaningfully contribute to the reconciliation and sustained stability in South Sudan. Selun commends the High Commissioner for its continued support to national institutions, civil society organizations. We encourage these efforts to continue, recognizing that South Sudan's led process, supported by regional and international community, are essential to achieving reconciliation and lasting peace. As the report outlines, South Sudan requires enhanced technical assistance and capacity building to address its human rights challenges. Supporting national institutions and justice mechanisms can reinforce accountability, improve protection systems, and sustain peace-building efforts. Therefore, we encourage coordinated, demand-driven international assistance that empowers South Sudan to fulfill its human rights obligations and solidify progress under the revitalized peace agreements.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. Vice President, Sri Lanka acknowledges the positive steps taken by the government of South Sudan in advancing nationally owned processes for reconciliation, institution building, and the promotion and protection of human rights. We particularly welcome the progress in the field of justice, including the enactment into law of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing Act and the Compensation and Reparation Authority Act, as well as steps taken towards their implementation. These mechanisms can make an important contribution to the truth, healing, reparation, and long-term reconciliation. We further welcome efforts to operationalize electoral institutions, strengthen civic and voter education, and engage political parties and civil society in preparation for a peaceful and inclusive democratic election. Mr. Vice President, Sri Lanka believes that South Sudan should be given the necessary space, time, and support to complete these nationally led processes. Technical assistance and capacity building must continue to be guided by the priorities and needs of South Sudan in a spirit of cooperation and constructive dialogue. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of China.
President, China welcomes the efforts by South Sudan to better protect human rights, including constructive cooperation with the OHCHR and the UN human rights mechanisms and accession to core international human rights conventions and concrete measures to combat crimes and protect the rights of groups such as women. China always advocates constructive dialogue and cooperation to address differences in human rights. We oppose the politicization and the instrumentalization of human rights and interference in the internal affairs of the country concerned. The debate in the Council should contribute to stability and development in South Sudan rather than the opposite. The international community should maintain the necessary inclusiveness and patience with regard to the political transition, increase its support, and encourage all parties to achieve reconciliation through dialogue in the political framework, promote transition in an orderly manner, and realize stability and development. The people of the country have the wisdom and capacity to resolve their own problems. China is ready to make positive efforts to the political transition process. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We continue to look closely at the development of the situation in South Sudan. We're concerned the continued confrontation between governmental forces and the opposition's military combats between undermine the peaceful lives and force people to leave their places where they live. And this exacerbates the very difficult humanitarian situation that is worsened by climate events. Now, Also, outside assistance is provided to assist different parties. In this context, it is very important that the efforts of the African community are aimed at a peaceful solution to military confrontation in the country. The key is to support national authorities to stabilize situations instead of exerting unnecessary pressures. We believe that the international community should focus its efforts to provide assistance to South Sudan in order to prevent any further escalation of tensions. As never before, the country requires technical assistance and it should not be facing any criticism in the face of these problems. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra a la distinguida representación de la República Popular Democrática de Corea.
The delegation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea commends the government of South Sudan for its continued cooperation with the Human Rights Council despite the challenges facing the country. We welcome the progress made in advancing transitional justice, including the establishment of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Compensation and Reparation Authority. We reaffirm the technical assistance and capacity building should be provided in accordance with the consent, priorities, and needs of the country concerned. In this regard, Agenda Item 10 remains the most appropriate framework for supporting post-conflict countries such as South Sudan. We call upon the international community to continue providing the necessary technical and financial support of this council. We express our solidarity with the people and government of South Sudan. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you.